Okay.
All right, welcome to Varn Blog. Today we're talking with Camilo Gomez, and we're going to be discussing the political situation post-COVID. Well, post is optimistic, but uh, post the worst of COVID, also optimistic. Um, in South America, there's been a lot of elections recently, and I don't think people in the states really kind of understand their importance. So, do you want to go over the uh, basics of the elections in Chile and Peru for stupid gringos?
Yeah, so I guess I could start with Peru. In the elections in Peru have been the first round of the presidential elections. So there were 18 candidates, and most were right wing. There was about one who was kind of centrist, and the rest were right wing. And one, it was a right wing party, but it was kind of a populist, so it was kind of weird economic points on some issues. But yeah,
Those
and the surprise was that Pedro Castillo was the candidate for Peru Free, which is, I guess, the most left leaning of the coalitions, um, passed to the second round with Keiko Fujimori, which is the daughter of the dictator Alberto Fujimori, and who also has been the leader of the Fujimorismo for all these years, which is a right wing authoritarian government political movement, which backed a coup last year. So yeah, it is quite unexpected, but I guess the explanation that some people might not think about it is that COVID-19 has been particularly bad in Latin America. So Latin America is among the worst hit regions because of different reasons, but mainly because of the lack of a healthcare system. So the healthcare systems are in pretty bad conditions in most of Latin America. And in the country where they had a much more functional healthcare system, which is Brazil, which despite Lula's all faults, he invested in the healthcare system. It was basically Bolsonaro who led to people try to assure people that everything was normal, there was no problem. He opposed any kind of control measures. So in that sense, like um, now Brazil has a lot of more fatalities because it is a much more populated country, but per capita, like Peru has the highest mortality. If we count excess death rates, it is about 150,000 Peruvians who have died, which is almost 0.5% of the population, which puts Peru as the country with the highest fatality rate in the entire world. So yeah, I think that is
at
kind of
least of countries with stats that we can take seriously. Yeah.
yes, that's true. Although I also gonna mention between the 10 countries who are in the top countries by excess rate per capita are countries neighboring countries, also Ecuador, Bolivia, and a lot of countries in Central Asia, which are generally less talk about it because it is a pretty complex region of the world from a linguistic standpoint. It is very diverse and complex, but also it is very hardly hidden by the pandemic.
Right. Well, yeah, I was about to say like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, those former Soviet kind of Islamicate, sometimes oil states that are kind of developed sometimes. I know a little bit more about them because I worked in East Asia for a while, and then it it was kind of the Wild West for teaching jobs in English. It was to go to like Kazakhstan and make $100,000 a year to live in a frozen wasteland. But let's talk more about the Peruvian political spectrum, because I don't think most North Americans, and at least most Anglo-North Americans, so I mean more than people in the States, but less, maybe Mexicans follow up more because of the language similarities, get the complicatedness of Peruvian politics. I dated a Peruvian woman for a while, and she would try to explain stuff to me, and I, who follow politics rather well, would kind of glaze over. So can you talk to me about the different right-wing factions in Peru, and what does the Peruvian center-left look like? So
yeah, I think it is quite strange. Like the right, in some ways, this election in particular has been divided around different kind of political parties. So Keiko Fujimori, I guess, she represented a more popular right in some way, in the kind of a more connection with the working class to some degree, like a hard hand approach to things. And in a country with has a lot of crime rates are getting pretty high, so her base of support in the first round was actually heavily in poor areas. So that was more or less her base of support. Like the Fujimorismo is currently under investigation of cleaning money, basically, like money laundering. It is a very corrupt organization. Some people say that Keiko Fujimori shouldn't be blamed for the crimes of his father, but the issue is that she's running. One of the candidates for Congress is the former Minister of Health of Alberto Fujimori, which is Alejandro Guinaga, who is currently under investigation for the case of the forced sterilizations that were in Peru in the 90s, which affected particularly poor women, and among them particularly indigenous women. I mean, it is a very authoritarian party. Like in Congress, it has blocked many measures in order to make the parties that were in charge look bad. So it supported a parliamentary coup last year, which was basically defeated on the streets. Sadly, with the loss of human lives, and two young men died, and there were several heavily injured. But and also something interesting to point out in that coup, the police took the side of the parliamentary coup, who was kind of a right-wing government, but further to the right, that Martin Vizcarra was much more centrist. But the military was very neutral, and that's one of the reasons why the kind of the counter protest was very important. And one of the things I talk about this with Lang and Zero Books, but it was something curious that the first to notice in the U.S. of the coup was the people of the Wall Street Journal, of all places. So that was something that I wasn't really expecting, but somehow, like, they were fairly critical of the coup for some reason that it is still strange to understand how. But it was curious. No government recognized basically the coup government, and it was basically a week of the coup, and then it was inaugurated kind of Francisco Sagasti, which is from a party that is centrist, which is the Morado party, which is a kind of attempt to create a liberal force in the I guess in the American sense of what liberal is. Not in the because liberal in Latin America sometimes means like has mean basically right wing conservative, although this kind of liberalism was kind of more of the centrism in some way. And I guess the other candidates that appear on the political map were curious, because one of them has been called like the Peruvian Bolsonaro, who's Rafael Lopez Aliaga, who's a successful businessman But he is like, if people think that Bolsonaro is a dumb Donald Trump, this guy was a dumb Bolsonaro. See, he sounded even more insane, even more much like it was basically a religious fundamentalist, a member of the Opus Dei, but he was in alliance with evangelicals. So it is curious, that kind of alliance, and I do think something curious about this election is that it's going to show that is a very fraud alliance, because at the end of the day, the Lopez Aliaga, surprisingly enough, did pretty bad among working class people. His base of support was on the urban areas in the wealthiest parts of the country, which was curious. So he was kind of the anti-Trump, because his base was the much more educated, but in some ways the much more anti-left in some way. And the other candidate was Hernando de Soto, which ran a very horseshoe theory campaign. He is known for many people to be a kind of libertarian, even if people from even the Mises Institute have been very critical of him. And I know from an economist who studied in the University of Chicago, did his graduate studies, a Peruvian economist who once talked with Gary Becker, but Gary Becker dismissed it as a grifter, basically. But he kind of has a reputation. The curious thing is that among his allies in this campaign was someone called Jorge Paredes Terry, who has been linked to Movadef, which is a shining path alliance organization in the eyes of many. So that was very weird. It was a weird development. I mean, Hernando Soto tried to do a campaign. Yeah, I see they are trying to connect Castillo and the Shining Path. What people miss about Castillo, which I guess we will start talking about him, because I think he's really kind of a maverick in many ways. So Castillo is a member of the teachers union, and actually, like, people sometimes, the people that are not in Peru and don't speak Spanish maybe not have seen the videos, but it was strange because he represented a faction in the teachers union that was fairly radical and had taken a much more radical position than even the Shining Path Alliance faction. So yeah, and also he's a rondero. So rondero is the kind of definition that there is of the kind of, I don't know how to call it, but basically in rural parts is kind of the popular justice. So they it was started, to stop kind of the small crimes, which was people trying to steal your, an animal from a farm, things like that, which were not big. But in the 80s, when terrorist attacks started, like, it was an anti-terrorist force. It basically became that. So and he also won. Well, it's true that he won 19% of the vote, which is not that much. Mm-hmm. But in the areas more affected by terrorism, like Ayacucho, he won more than 50% of the vote. And in Ayacucho, there is still a strong kind of anti-Shining Path feeling, because of obvious reasons of one of the most impacted regions from terrorism in Peru.
So this sounds very complicated. The analogies I had for it were actually weirdly from South Korea's politics 8 years ago, 9 years ago, 10 years ago when I was there, where you had a highly fractious right and a kind of center-left renewal, which was able to emerge after one faction of the right defeated another faction of the right. And one of the reasons why that's hard to explain to Americans is one right faction is Protestant in Korea, so it's Christian, but also more aligned to the United States. And the other rightist faction, Park, who was the daughter of the former dictator of South Korea. Funny how that rhymes. Was largely Buddhist and wanted slightly more positive relationships with conservative elements in China to kind of split it away from North Korea. Also was more interested in suppressing labor than the more American-friendly conservatives were, and eventually she went down in scandal, which was what got rid of her government, and the kind of center left was able to come to power there about 3-4 years ago. I'm trying to remember the exact date. It sounds like Peru has a similarly complicated situation where you have very many different factions on the right, kind of allowing the center left to emerge again. But it's kind of a weird center left from an American standpoint, right? Because it sounds like it has elements of, hyper radicalization. Also, the voting patterns of left, right in Latin America don't really fit the urban rural patterns of the United States, and which is interesting because that's I'm trying to think of other countries that are that divergent, and it doesn't come to mind. I think maybe most of them would be in South America or in Central Asia, or in West Africa. But like even Mexico is beginning to develop the same kind of voting patterns of the U.S., where Mexico City has become slightly left-tinged-ish, and the educated people are more and more aligned with the left. But there's still a labor history there. There's a couple of things I think that are unique to the English-speaking North American left, where they kind of assume that everything right-wing in Latin America must secretly be the province of the United States or the CAA, as if right-wing coups couldn't happen in these countries on their own. What do you think? If you were to talk to Americans about how they should feel and why they should care about this election and how they should interpret the splintering of the right in Peru, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I do think it is interesting because I feel that there is kind of the idea basically that Peru and a lot of Americans, even some people that on theory will be well educated because one sees the titles they have, the positions they have, even in academia or think tanks on things like that. Like particular economists have been saying that Peru has had an economic miracle. It's true that there have been a lot of economic growth because Peru has a lot of mining resources. So in the numbers, you see a lot of economic growth. But the reality day to day is that for a lot of people in parts of rural Peru, particularly, they feel left behind, and particularly in the pandemic, which the rural parts, it's much more difficult. That there are hospitals or any kind of formal health service. So they feel left behind. And in some ways, it was a vote of protest more than a vote of, I think, for the left in itself. Now there is a poll in this, a post first round poll, and it puts Pedro Castillo with 42% versus Keiko Fujimori with 31%. So Pedro Castillo is leaning. I wouldn't call him center left. I mean, his party, Peru Free, has his platform is called Marxist Leninism, Mariategism. So
not that center.
not center. But the issue is on social issues, they are fairly more conservative. So Pedro Castillo opposed abortion, opposed gay marriage, opposed transgender rights, opposed even gender approach education to.
So the traditional Leninist platform after World War II actually tends to be fairly socially conservative, but it's interesting that that's still a major issue, and in the Latin American left. Is that to keep Catholic? Is that to keep like Catholic peasants in the coalition, or is it sincerely? Is it worked into their Marxist-Leninism somehow? How does that work?
Yeah, I will say something that is interesting. So Pedro Castillo is a teacher, and that is very central to this conversation because Latin America represents more or less the classical model of capitalism. So a class that owns capital and the class that the only thing they have is their labor. So
that's funny to Americans, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but it is an interesting issue because he lives in the town that where he was born. So he studied for being a teacher in return. I think his politics, I think he really truly believes that. There are elements, it seems, in Peru free that do believe in abortion. They do believe that abortion, because the issue is that there is a huge problem, not only in Peru but in Latin America, with teenage pregnancies, and an important number of them are product of rape. So that do complicate a lot of issues because obviously, like many of those teenagers have to drop out of school. So and a lot of studies have shown that in Peru and Latin America in general, if you drop out of high school and you don't have family income, it is very difficult to move out from poverty. It's almost impossible.
Yeah.
So,
and is high school in Peru covered? Okay, what years does high school cover in Peru? So, because I don't think Americans understand how the Latin American school system, North Americans don't tend to understand how Latin American school systems tend to work.
So the elementary school covers from between 6 years, generally from 6 to 12, and from
so
12
primary
to 17 is secondary, is high school.
Okay, so it's a little bit different than Mexico. So where secundaria ends at like 14, but then they have preparatoria, but that's not covered by the state. So
no, high school is covered by the state.
In Peru, okay, got it.
Yes, I do think it is interesting. Some of his relatives, it seems that they are Protestants. So I think Presbyterians. So while a lot of people are familiar with Catholics in Latin America, the issue is a lot of times by the association of Catholicism with the central government, a lot of people who feel left behind had actually lived the Catholic Church and are embracing different forms of Christianity. Also, we're noting one of the parties which didn't make the cut and only ran for Congress, but it was in the current Congress, is called FREPAP. And they are a weird kind of party because they are a religious party that comes out of an organization that believe that the Incas were the lost tribe of Israel. So they have a very weird combination of kind of a conception of evangelical.
That sounds like British Israelis, but with the Inca as opposed to white people.
Yeah. So they have a combination of evangelical Christianity and their reading of Inca religion and a big notion of ancient Israel. I mean, it is quite curious, and I think
it sounds like it sounds like Latin Mormons. But I mean, there are Latin Mormons, but
Also, we're noting like the region from which Pedro Castillo is Cajamarca. So he's from Chota, which is a much more, and I think that's an interesting and relevant element to discuss, I think. And it's the ethnic identification. It is curious. I haven't seen Pedro Castillo identify himself particularly as some other candidates in other parts of Latin America. But I do feel there is much more of a connection that Pedro Castillo has formed with regular rural population than, for example, Veronica Mendoza. So Veronica Mendoza was born in Cusco, but her mother is French. So I mean, his father maybe is not white, but I think she looks white in the Peruvian context, and maybe because of that there is kind of a distance because her platform was much more moderate on economic issues. Although on social issues she was much more progressive. So she supported like abortion, gay marriage, transgender rights, gender approach in educations. But I mean, she didn't did that bad, but there are some people that were elected from Congress in her party, but still, like it wasn't able to connect in the way that Pedro Castillo was. I feel that it is very curious. Cajamarca is a very poor region, and I think that's a very relevant element of
I'd also say like trying to explain Peruvian racial notions to Americans is really hard. So it's, you know, like what counts as white, what counts as indigenous, what counts as you know. I have a friend who to someone in the States she looks just Latina, but when you she told me in Peru she's seen as black because she has some African ancestry somewhere pretty far back actually. Um, and I realized that Americans tend to have, you know, a kind of binary notion of white, black, and then there are these other people, Asians, and then we guess Latinos, and then there's indigenous people, we think they're people, whatever. Like, and I say that flippantly because that's about how complicated. It's a very binary system, white, other groups, you know, and Peru, from if it's anything like Mexico, and from people I've talked to from Peru, um, that old casta like gradient thing is still kind of around, where there's a much less binary notion of race, but it would be hard for Americans to interpret it. We would not understand the racial categories, I think.
yeah. In Cajamarca is particularly curious because not in the province from his where from Castillo, he's from Chota, which I think is much more common to other parts that has a kind of indigenous important presence there. But in the more northern part of Cajamarca, in Selendín, there is a French historian, Nathan Bachtel, who has written about the Jewish origins of the city. So people tend to associate the city with Jews, which sounds strange and I think almost surreal to
Yeah.
Americans.
So we got some questions. Would he be a post left populist if he were American? Castillo. I think people need to remember though that Leninism, historically speaking, has been very conservative on sexual issues from World War II till about the year 2000, even in the United States. Not that we have a whole lot of Leninists running around, but I mean, in so much that the 400 or 500 people we did, if you go back and read like RCP pamphlets or CPUSA pamphlets, the CPUSA was very quiet on sexual issues, and the RCP actually was still on the, like, you know, homosexuality is a bourgeois deviation until the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st. They did drop it, I think they formally dropped it in the late 90s. So I would say that's just something to realize when we're talking about Latin American Leninists. They're still they don't have our cultural concerns. So I wouldn't say, calling him post left would probably be foreign. But I would ask, is he a left populist, or is he more is Castillo's positions more in line with traditional Marxist parties in Peru? You know, not so much talking about, you know, everyone's favorite weird bugbear Shining Path, but the other Marxist parties. Or is he more conservative than that on social issues? Like, is he more conservative than the average Marxist you would meet in Lima?
That's an interesting question. So the Marxists I have met in Lima generally were young, so they had more or less a progressive vision on social issues. Um, that is an interesting question. It is difficult to really answer, but the issue is that Castillo was polling pretty bad in Peru, in Lima, and in Peru in general until very basically the last 4 weeks he started growing like crazy because like people were kind of tired. He was the kind of ultimate outsider. Um, but I will say that I think that the issue is that particularly Peru Free, which is his party, is a very rural party. So they are currently the government in Junín, which is a region in the center of Peru, and the Vladimir Cerrón, who is the candidate for vice president, is known for making a lot of conservative statements on social issues. So I think that it is true that it maybe in some way kind of the old left had a lot of problems on these issues, and it's difficult to know how it's going to shift. That I think is going to be a complex path to understand where it will go.
So I have an incendiary question on my own that I might ask then. I remember when Duterte came to power in the Philippines, Latin American and a lot of anti-imperialist leftists in the States were initially somewhat skeptically supportive of Duterte. They're not anymore, obviously. But I think about the same kind of relationship to paramilitary groups and vigilante groups that you were describing Castillo might have, is particularly in fighting terrorism. Is there a chance that Castillo could be a Duterte-like figure more than what Americans would consider a left figure?
That's an interesting question. I think the ronderos are very curious because they are a very kind of rural phenomenon in much more urban areas that they don't necessarily exist. So in that sense, it is curious that the ronderos have some kind of left-leaning rhetoric sometimes.
Because they're mostly fighting like the Shining Path, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, the issue is that it is curious. Despite that, I do think it was curious, but a topic that is not many times mentioned is that basically many people on the left voted for Fujimori in the 90s because in the runoff it was him or Vargas Llosa. Vargas Llosa was seen as a much more of of a right winger in the sense that he's a white male that has kind of preconceived notions, and even if the left wasn't that woke, in the issue where Latin American left is different is that obviously the representation is important, and you see that in the case of Evo Morales, or maybe we could talk later about Yacu Perez in Ecuador, which are examples that show that there is I will say it's not useful to use the term anti-woke to describe some politicians because it's not the center of their politics. I mean, like Rafael Lopez Aliaga, the Peruvian Bolsonaro, was much more anti-woke and he didn't pass to the second round. So there's that. So I do think it is complex to know what is going to happen. But what it is, as I mentioned, there is a lot of more violent crimes being committed now. So as I mentioned, the Peru is one of the countries that is much more struggling with COVID-19. So obviously for any criminal, getting in jail will be kind of could be a death sentence because like the infections are high in prison, so they are acting in a much more violent way than normal, and even normal is sometimes fairly violent.
Yeah. So is Peru's crime rates beginning to resemble its Central American neighbors, like Ecuador, dear God, let's hope it's not getting anywhere near Honduras or anything like that. But like, is that becoming a trend? Is that pattern spreading through South America?
I think there is a very interesting Peruvian philosopher who has had very interesting reflections. The issue with crime in Peru is that it is not organized. So, yeah, I mean, there are criminals who act very kind of uh, which much more, I guess, violence than before, like literally shooting before robbing someone. So before it was somebody was robbed and he resisted, he or she resisted, it was then shot. But now it's kind of preemptive shooting people. But it's not. I mean, in Central America, as far as I understand, it's much more of kind of the criminal gangs as gangs.
You have cartels and mobs and the U.S. government. And,
Yeah, here is much less organized, but I think the perception is that crime is kind of out of control. So, I mean, he has said that the rondas campesinas are going to have a role. So it's interesting to say. In some way, I think he challenged many kind of common assumptions of left and right that traditionally people have, and I don't think he's going to go Duterte-like, but I think he's going to have a tough on crime approach in some way.
So okay, so we won't see him like have paramilitary gangsters going and executing everybody in the street, but we will see a tough on crime movement coming from the left in Peru, probably if Castillo is the it wins the presidency.
Yes, I think there is a possibility.
Okay, so not Duterte, but on a spectrum towards Duterte, which I emphasize this because I think that you brought up three issues, that I want to emphasize for our North American listeners who are clueless to the issues of South and Central American politics. One is indigenous representation and colorism and undoing that history of Creole dominance of Creole in the context of Latin America, meaning white, I guess. I mean, that's the closest analogous to it. Dominance of the political structure, that's being undone, finally. You have the fact that social norms are still much more conservative and they don't break down cleanly amongst left and right, except in the urban areas, which are highly educated and thus would probably reflect North American and European values more. And three, the issue of crime and criminal violence is, I don't know how to put this, because Americans think the United States is a very violent place in terms of gun violence, and compared to Western Europe, we are, but compared to Latin America, we're really soft, and you're pretty safe. Yes, I don't mean to overgeneralize that because a lot of people use that as like a racial stereotypes against Latinos, obviously, but like there's a lot more violent crime related to poverty because development's so uneven in Latin America than there is in the North, in the United States and Canada. Except for like the poorest areas of the United States would be the only places that would be comparable. And it's sometimes hard for me to get, like, when I was trying to tell people, like, why I got offered a job in Guatemala City and we had to really think about it. And I really wanted to take the job, but ultimately I decided no. And people wondered why. And I'm like, well, I'm kind of a big mugging target. Like, I just am. And it's one of those things where I was like, it was hard for me to explain. I'm like, the violent crime rates are 3 to 4 times higher. I mean, and admittedly, Guatemala is worse than anywhere in South America except for maybe Caracas. But then I don't have a thing to. There's nothing comparable in the U.S. for me to like draw an analogy to, and so the crime issue is a tough one, I think, for people to understand how much purchase that has, not just for, rich urban, bourgeoisie, but also just like the average person in Latin America. That's a big deal. I mean, it's not so much in like Chile and Argentina, but it definitely is in
Argentina is
Peru.
growing, actually. Like Argentina is growing. Yeah, and Chile is also growing. I think the only places where
it's growing here too, actually.
Yeah,
But
I think the only places in Latin America where crime is not that big of a deal, I think, are Uruguay and Costa Rica, and the rest.
Costa Rica has like almost none, but why is Uruguay? I've actually always wondered this. Why is Uruguay so much successful on this front than the rest of Latin America?
I think it is interesting. I mean, like Uruguay had basically what Guatemala was going to have, special economic zones.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Shenzhen, like in China, in communist China, in theory, was open. So I mean, that was a continuity of the policies. I mean, the Uruguay left is very broad. Like it has literally positives, but it has fairly moderate social democrats and everything in between.
Okay, so let's still talk about Peru for a second, but I want to talk about Peru now in the context of Latin America and maybe even its relations to the United States. Peru is not a country that most Americans pay that much attention to, except when leftists want to, like, I don't know, fetishize the Shining Path or something. But really, like, even though there's a lot of Peruvian immigrants here, there's big Peruvian communities in the areas where I live, actually here in West Salt Lake, but it's not an area that has the same kind of eye on it like Central America does because of the immigration issues, or it doesn't get the kind of attention that Bolivia and Venezuela do because it doesn't have, as sexy of a left narrative. What will Castillo mean for U.S. Peruvian relations and relations to the countries nearby in Peru? So how's it going to change geopolitics in the area?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I do think Castillo and his party, Peru Free, has a very critical approach to the U.S. and imperialism, and they actually argue that this kind of left-wing policies on social issues are linked to the funds of NGOs, and so kind of the conspiratorial way. Because I mean, it's true in some degree. There are some people on the more center left who are connected to the NGOs, but then the Trots basically have social liberal policies, and they are not funded by the by the NGOs. I mean, the Trots are there are different Trots in Peru that also have at least the ones I have here, more or less generally, more of the traditional, the new traditional positions on these issues of social issues. So I do think they are critical of the U.S. in being critical of Lima, particular, which they see as a kind of a city that looks overseas more than it looks to the rest of the country, and it kind of abandons the rest of the country. So in that sense, I think they are critical. It's difficult to say whether, like, how much is going to change the relationship with the U.S. But I do think what is interesting is that Evo Morales, like the day that it was announced that the day of the elections was also the day of the elections in Ecuador. Was the second round, and it was the elections in Bolivia, the second round of the regional votes. So, but one of the things he has been mentioned these days, it is that his sympathy for Castillo, and it is curious because he in the first round basically endorsed Veronica Mendoza, which was much more connected to the I guess Latin American left. So it is a left that hasn't developed that many relationships. It's true that one of the founders of the party, Vladimir Cerrón, studied medicine in Cuba, but it doesn't seem to be, that close to Cuba now. So it is a much more kind of organic in some way form of the Peruvian left.
So it would not feel, you would not say, for example, this is not like a second coming of a pink wave, coming out of like the Cuba Morales spread of maybe
interesting
10 years ago.
I think we could talk later about Chile, which I think it's going to be a very wild card because there are a lot of different candidates on the left, and but yeah, I think it's a different issue. I think it is has to do. I think Castillo is kind of in some ways a rejection of the system, but much in a sense that it's not as ideological as it could seem, but in a sense that they link the system with corruption, which is true. Even the National Bureau of Economic Research, which by no means a left-wing organization, published a paper that like market reforms weaken the public healthcare systems in Latin America. So, I mean, in some sense, it's true because by weakening the public healthcare system, there has a boom of private healthcare system in many countries in Latin America, and many times with deep ties to politicians in the region.
So one thing I think maybe our American, because I think like what 75% of my audience are Marxists probably, of some variety, but maybe one thing that they don't would be interesting to understand and maybe clarify for things to them. What would Castillo's stance be towards Venezuela and China, which are separate issues? But I think if maybe this will get to some of the complicatedness of a kind of organic from Peruvian left.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I think with Venezuela, they are going to be much less critical than any government before.
Okay.
Even the center left, like Veronica Mendoza, had been much more critical lately. So with China, it is a big mystery. It's not clear what is going to be their position for them.
So one thing I will say that people don't seem to understand about the Mexican left, and again, I realize that Mexico is not South America, but a lot of my understandings of issues coming out of the region is that a lot of the Mexican left doesn't really trust China, and there's also a long-standing, let's say, xenophobia that's specifically targeted at China, like similar to the way it often targets Jews. Is there any sentiment like that in Peru, or is China just like outside of the experience? Is there a history of Chinese immigrant labor in the same way there is in Central America? Like, is anything going to complicate that, or is it just going to be pure geopolitics?
Yeah, I mean, it is curious. Peru has the largest Chinese diaspora in Latin America.
I did not know that. So that's a big deal.
Well, there is close or more, depending on the counts, of 1 million of people that are partially at least of Chinese descent, and there are people that immigrate, you will see on the streets people that were speaking some Chinese language that it clearly seemed that they were not tourists, because they were kind of buying in the supermarket, and you see it, it doesn't seem like it was seem like they were immigrating. Like,
is there a history of anti-Chinese sentiment amongst non-Chinese in Peru?
Not that much. What is curious is that even a party like Red Farland, which is one of the communist parties, from the Maoist tradition, has been sounded, at least some of one of its some of its members have been sounding critical on China lately. So there is a kind of weird development. I don't know.
I've actually, interestingly, the Maoist parties in the United States, which again are tiny and not politically important, but they have switched in the opposite direction. Whereas, historically, since the 1980s, they've been very critical of China, and then in the last 5 years have been a more and more simpatico with I'm gonna just say it, explicit Chinese outreach efforts, actually, like the Cal Collective and the Confucius Institute. Where, but I was wondering if, like, maybe I'd heard from more than you that the opposite trend was happening in Latin America, that China was beginning to be seen as maybe another imperialist power in this, like maybe not in those terms, but that it could be, and it could be a problem for regional autonomy. So I don't know, like is that are Peruvians worried about China replacing, bullying, Latin America the way the U.S. does, or is that like, because that seems to be a bigger debate in, say, North Africa?
I do think that that is not something as explicit, but it's true that the help that the Chinese government did in the pandemic was very small. Basically, a group of Chinese physicians visited the country, and at the end, they say, "You're basically fuck it up," and people were very pissed. But in reality, it was kind of true. Peru doesn't have the health infrastructure to deal with a crisis, and I think probably also one of the reasons why Peru has been even more impacted than other countries that are neighboring, like Ecuador or Bolivia, which have a lot of similarities in different issues, is that a lot of Peruvian population is concentrated in Lima because of the lack of opportunities in the interior of the country. So in Ecuador, there is kind of the more diversity in the sense that like there is Quito, but there is also Guayaquil, which is another pool of development, and you have La Paz, but you also have Santa Cruz, which is another pool of development in many ways. But in Peru, there's not a city that reaches that kind of similarity. Like Lima is kind of hegemonic, so it seems that the COVID-19 spread in Lima, and when a lot of people, particularly working class people who couldn't pay rent, were going back to their towns, they actually live with them, with COVID-19, and so it expanded even quicker than in other parts. So I think they were honest, I will say, but obviously from a diplomatic perspective, it was very dumb to say it openly, like, and the media repeated, and yeah, in the minds of many people, it didn't help with anything.
Sure. So how monolithic I think a lot of American and Canadians think that the U.S. hyper dominates Latin American politics. Well, I do think that's probably true in Central America. It's definitely an influence on Mexico. It's a huge influence on, and particularly drug policy on Nicaragua and Ecuador and San Salvador, those areas. But how influential is American policy right now? I know there's a lot of anger over historical American issues, but how is it a huge effect for a lot of Central America? I know that, like, for example, when I talk to Chileans, they seem pretty removed from U.S. concerns. So what do you think the issue is there? Like,
Yeah, I think it is interesting because I do think there is an important political relationship, but not in the way that the people will understand it traditionally.
okay,
So in the last election, there was the U.S. embassy invited all the leading candidates to a lunch in the U.S. embassy. Among the leading candidates in the congressional election, it was a member of a Trotsky's organization, and he sent a letter which was very clever. Like he said that I won't go to a meeting in an embassy which is deporting Latin Americans. And yeah, so there was that. I mean, the U.S. embassy, it seems that it tries to reach in a horseshoe theory like everyone, but
yeah,
it is.
well, yeah, I always told people, like, you can always find the CIA's hands in everything because their strategy is literally to give everybody a little bit of money so that they have some influence no matter what happens natively. And people are always like, "What do you mean?" But I'm like, they're just diversifying their political portfolio. That's what they do. Like,
Well, I will say some is, but the issue is conservatives do look a lot to Latin America, to the conservatives in Latin America look a lot to the U.S. because particularly the evangelical have grown in a lot of parts of Latin America. In Mexico less, but in the rest of Latin America they have grown quite
they've even grown in
high.
Mexico, just not to the same extent. But I don't think Americans know that because evangelicism is dying here. Like, what's the largest religion in the United States? Catholicism.
Yeah, that's
Like,
serious.
I mean,
Um,
like,
which,
I mean,
as I mentioned, I think it's going to lead to a very curious path because there have been some right-wing Catholics that have kind of questioned the alliance in Peru lately, like
mm,
because they are arguing that Catholicism has at the end a different message, and it is curious because like even the priests here like make a lot of reference to Israel, to not the Israel of today, but to the ancient Israel. And there is a historian, another historian, French historian. A lot of French historians have done history of Latin America, particularly the Andes. Jacques Lafayette, who even has a book about Latin American being the true Judeo-Christian civilization, which is kind of curious. But the truth is that yeah, I mean, a lot of in rural parts of Peru, like the Shiva, which is the Jewish ritual of mourning the dead, it is common in rural parts, which is kind of strange. And I had heard of that ritual. I didn't knew it was Jewish until a historian mentioned it, which was kind of crazy. But it is true that this kind of I think is curious because they also have a very the kind of organic relationship in the sense that evangelical sometimes even send money to kind of right-wing Latin Americans. So it is a very kind of complicated relationship. I do think it is going to also the so I think the relationships have shifted to a much more state relationship, to a more of non-state actors messing in the affairs of the region.
mm-hmm. So let's move up to the broader South American politics a little bit. What's going on in Argentina and Chile?
Yeah, Argentina is
there.
crazy. I mean, like, it seems libertarians are gaining ground, but at the same time, like, libertarians are somehow, like, some libertarians at least are rallying around a Trotskyist of all people because he opposed some taxes. And I mean, he has a very heterodox view. He's a member, he is called Gabriel Solano, who is a member of the Workers' Party. Maybe some Americans. Have here of Jorge Altamira,
Mm-hmm.
an historic leader of Argentinian Trotskyism. So it is curious because in some way in Argentina, in a very strange way, Trotskyism is seen as a kind of third way between Peronism and anti-Peronism, and it is bizarre because like I do think Argentina has much more politicized the pandemic with the government, the Peronist government going to the side of caution, a lot of lockdowns and things like that, and kind of the COVID-19 skeptics being from the right, basically in a large part. Um, and the poverty rates are growing, but in reality, also, I don't think it's just the failure of fairness; it's the failure of Macri and its government and its incompetence. In some ways, both are incompetent, like the Peronists and the anti-Peronists. So it's difficult how things are going to change. I think the country's poverty rate is growing like crazy. I think they have a poverty rate of 40%, which is very high by Latin American standards, and child poverty is in 60%. So it's pretty high, despite that they have a lot of social programs. But it seems that it's growing. So it's difficult to say what's going to happen. It's certainly a very complex panorama. In Chile, it is much wilder because there were kind of two coalitions, one of the center left, one of the left, and some elements of the far left. And the left and some elements of the far left was divided, basically. One of the parties left, which is curiously because was called the Liberal Party, and they are kind of egalitarian liberals. And with them, they left some kind of social democratic members of Democratic Revolution was kind of a left-wing party there, moved with them, and now they have their own presidential candidate, which is Paulo Vidal. But the most known candidates, I think, are Daniel Jaraue, which was a mayor in a municipality in Santiago, and he's of the Communist Party, but he's actually fairly popular because he installed like popular pharmacies, were pharmacies with lower prices, so he became quite popular. Mm. And there is Pamela Giles, which is kind of a left-wing populist. She's more known for doing the Naruto run in Congress, and there are a lot of candidates from the Socialist Party, the party for another centrist left party. So it is difficult to say how it's going to configure. Some people want a great primary between all the forces, including, and that is some curious, the Christian Democrats, which in most countries are kind of right-wing, and in Chile also are kind of right-wing, but for some reason are allied with the left, even if a lot of times they kind of block the projects of the left. But one of the big, elections coming near is the Constitutional Convention, which is the first constitutional convention which gender parity, and it has representation of the indigenous people of Chile, which is important. Also, there is a very kind of complicated Mapuche conflict going on, and to be honest, I'm not seeing that much the left-wing candidates talking about those issues, even if the Mapuche cause is seen as a left-wing cause. It is complex to say what is going to happen in the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention, basically, it is a result of Piñera being a coward.
Okay.
Yeah. So the people in the massive protest wanted, like more or less, basically Piñera to run away, to renounce. But his compromise was the Constitutional Convention, basically. And it is complex, the situation, because like as people might remember, like there were massive mobilizations, and it kind of reached the imagination, the public imagination, in the eyes of many, because like it was very colorful, and there was an organization called the Brigada Antifascista, which were kind of people dressed as anime characters, where in the protest women dressed as Sailor Moon, someone was dressed as Pikachu, and someone as Spider-Man, things like that I think bring a colorful to the protest, which at the beginning it was kind of people seem to link with extremism, because some people started to burn in the metro station. But I do feel that obviously the majority weren't that radical, and were much more of a reformist mindset. But the issue is the Constitutional Convention is divided. So because the left, all the forces in the center, far left, the left, and the center left hasn't been in an accord, so they are competing against each other, and that could let that the right, which is more united, could win on those elections, and it's going to be kind of a backlash in some way. So it is difficult what to say. In some ways, the presidential election, which is also this year, is going to be wide open. So Harawe and were more left wing candidates, obviously, like Harawe, and which is a communist, and Pamela Giles, who is she is it's much more of a populist left, but she's to the left of the center left that has been governing the country for before Piñera. So the other candidate is very curious, like Joaquin Lavín, which is, some people have called him a right-wing social democrat. And so it is strange how the election could wrap up, because it's going to be a very messy thing.
So, for those in America hoping for another pink wave that they can feel good about and yet do nothing to help, I'm sorry, you can hear my contempt for a lot of the pink wave cheerleading from the past 10 years. What has COVID helped the center left? Because it did seem for a while that we were seeing a right-wing insurgence in Latin America, some of which from U.S. influence, but a lot of which was actually pretty local. No, we haven't discussed Ecuador yet. Sorry. We'll talk about that in a minute. Has COVID just sort of shucking Latin American politics up to the point that just kind of randomly a slightly more radical left than even the last round may benefit in some areas. I mean, it definitely looks like it might happen in Peru. Argentina is surprising. I don't like. I think like you, when I'm looking at Chile, I don't know enough about the indigenous politics, and B, I feel like it's a coin toss as to how that's going to go. You just have no idea. And then Bolsonaro's flubbing up Brazil so badly. You have the attempted I sometimes think the left narrative on what happened in Bolivia is a little bit naive, but you have, Morales' political crisis, the coup, and then his, the resurgence. What is there any trend to be deduced from this other than COVID kind of shook everyone's politics up? Is there something bigger than that going on? Like, what do you think?
I think it's interesting. I think we could talk a bit about Bolivia too. I think it's a good example to talk about this. I think like the government of Jenny Náñez was fairly incompetent in managing the COVID-19 crisis, and the vote for Luis Arce was a protest vote. Obviously, MAS has an important base of the social movement. Mm-hmm. But it was also about people who don't have that much sympathy to the mass, but they wanted to move behind this Jenny Náñez. The curious thing is that at the end, the kind of candidate was near Arce of the mass in the polls was technically a centrist, but since he was backed by the right, it was seen as antipathetic, as something odious to a lot of the even the anti-mass left. I think in some ways opposed him. So and supported Luis Arce, who is more moderate, and that should be said. Luis Arce is an economist who worked for the government even before Morales um, entered the government. So he was the minister of finance, so he's not as radical as other elements in the mass. I do think there has been a lot of backlash toward the mass. So in the regional elections that happened the same day in Peru, like basically like the train has been bugged up. Like it is the mass has been defeated, although by Hayaya, which is a very complex political organization to define. They backed Chi with South Korean Christian Protestant right winger in the presidential
Right.
elections, but now backed a lot of, at least rhetorically, left wing indigenous candidates. And something that I have here, it is that there were some debates in La Paz, in Aymara, for the regional election, and that was interesting. I do think what sometimes is forgotten about Bolivia is how central is Aymara identity to Bolivia. They have more Quechua speakers, but the issue is that Quechua is seen by many. Uh, a lot of Quechua speakers don't identify as Quechua because a lot of them have identified as the pre-Inca identity they had. So even if they speak, like for example, in Peru, like the people in the center of the Andes, in the center of the Peruvian Andes, identify sometimes as Huanca, which was the population that was kind of the denomination before the Incas. So, but the Aymara identity is much more kind of a unified political identity, and I think it is both in the mass and in some of the anti-mass left. It is a very kind of potent force because it's much more organized in a way which is quite curious. El Alto, which is the city where a lot of the protests against the government have happened, is a very curious city because some people have defined it like many. If people have seen a very colorful, architecture in the Andes, it's probably an image of the Alto. So the cholets are kind of this construction that has been defined by some as the they're very different. It is curious. Some look like literally transformers, and the interior seems like a Bollywood movie. So it is like they matter. Like people forget, but they matter are central not only to Andean history but to war history. Like the the mine of Potosí was in the Aymara realm. It's true that it was originally part of the Tahuantinsuyo, so the Inca Empire, but it was majority Aymara speaker of the area. So it kind of have a. So in many ways, the Aymara are very curious in the way that they are very local. So in the sense that many argue that the Aymara, originated around the Titicaca Lake, and a lot of the populations that now live around the Titicaca Lake are still Aymara speakers. But but at the same time, they are represent a kind of global indigenous, in the sense that it is curious because I don't think it is only like architecture or politics. It's kind of a whole political project of trying to bring in some ways the past, but at the same time the future, which is strange. And I do think it is kind of a project that exceeds the what we could see as traditionally left-wing views, because obviously there is a lot of importance to the idea of tradition, but at the same time of kind of a tradition that is rebel. And I think it's interesting that because I think they question about Ecuador in the questions, and I think it is also that like people, a lot of the people in the American left seem very sympathetic to Correa, but what many people don't know is that Correa conflicted with indigenous movement in Ecuador, and actually arrested some of the indigenous leaders, including Jaco Perez, who was kind of he was fairly close. Yacu Perez is the left-wing candidate of the Pachacuti movement, which is the indigenous movement is very diverse, and Yacu Perez certainly is not the most left-wing, but it was funny seeing some Americans arguing that he was a right-wing in many ways. He's not. I mean, as I mentioned, he's not the most left-wing in his movement, but he was a representative of the movement, and they took a position of neutrality toward the second round was between Andres Arauz, who was curiously enough, like people talk a lot about the PNC. He's actually an American educated economist. He studied in the University of Michigan, which is not common. Like people in general in Latin America don't go to study particular undergraduate degree because there is basically no full scholarships to undergraduate degrees in the U.S. For international students. So, yeah, but as I mentioned, like I think the Correísmo represents kind of a criollo left in some ways, and I think like some people are curious because like uh, the campaign of Correa was around the correazo, like and the Correa with it's a whip in Spanish, but it kind of, even if at that point like it was a teenager and my knowledge of Andean history was fairly limited, but I found it strange because like before, like it was not so much time ago that like kind of the whiplash was linked to kind of exploitation of in the agricultural sector, because like kind of when the independence started, basically a new kind of the criollo elite had the fields and basically so he had a very kind of criollo campaign and a very criollo identity, is the identity of of Correísmo. And also one thing that is worth mentioning is that while there are important focus that Correa had in education, he also closed the rural schools. So his argument was that rural schools were poorly performing, but the issue is that a lot of people live very far away to another school, so their kids will have to walk hours to go to another school, and that for a lot of indigenous people was kind of an insult to them, like because it will complicated a lot of issues. They would see obviously their kids much less time, and it was a complication for them. So there are a lot of issues, but I do think in some ways the Ecuadorian the Correísmo shows kind of the shift between the between indigenous people and left-wing politics, because it's not necessarily seen always as the same thing. And also we're mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. I mean,
Yeah,
I was also just thinking about like, how does this relate to, for say, Lenin Moreno's tensions with his former mentor and all that? Like, how does the indigenous issue split there, too? Because I know that like Moreno, like has really become since 2017 become more and more frustrated with Korea and Correismo, but
yeah, I mean, Lenin Moreno was kind of the picket successor to Correa, and basically he moved to the right, but like Correa, he was had a very pretty tense relationship with the indigenous movement, so there was massive indigenous protests. The issue is that Ecuador is even less covered than Peru, and there was not too much coverage, but there were massive protests. So it is curious, but Peruvian media doesn't cover Ecuador that much, despite it being very being neighboring countries. But
well, America covers it not at all. Like
yeah, like people were burning the city basically. Like it felt like it was correct. Yeah, like Lenin Moreno had to leave almost, because it seemed like a revolution for a moment, but it kind of was controlled in some way. But I do think it seems that the indigenous vote was fairly divided. So What is not necessarily that mentioned is that a lot of indigenous people are converting to different forms of evangelical Christianity, and many of the evangelical Christianity, not all, have fairly right-leaning um, policies on social issues. The issue why they supported Yacu Perez, despite that he was socially progressive, is that it was much more of their, ethnic identification with him. But now, which was, Andres Arauz was much more of a criollo, and Guillermo Lasso was a more conventional right winger, but a social conservative. They kind of picked the social conservative. So it's not a clear cut, issue, because it is much more divided.
Well, I mean, one of the things I'll say is indigenous issues in the United States are also equally complicated, in so much that, like, if you look at how most of the reservations vote, they vote conservative. They're more likely to be evangelical Christians than or Mormons than most of the rest of the population in the U.S. With some Catholic exceptions in the Northeast. However, if you like, that can shift really fast. So, like with the example with the Navajo and COVID, they were so devastated by COVID that they, their party allegiance and pretty much threw a state to the Democrats. So what I think a lot of Americans, because their encounters with indigenous issues are from indigenous academics, usually don't realize how complicated this is. And Bolivia in the mass is actually interesting that you brought this up, is actually the odd one out that's been able to keep the indigenous and the left together in a way that really hasn't happened. I mean, it also, like, I don't know, I haven't been reading, for example, as AMLO is anemic as a leftist as he is popular amongst the indigenous in, like, South Central Mexico or whatever. I haven't seen those numbers. And I guess I do read Spanish well enough that I could probably look them up, so I should. But it's an interesting issue, because I think Bolivia leads most Americans to think that trend is true across Latin America, and it's not. And I do think it's another thing that you've been pointing out. A lot of the historical frustrations with the Catholic churches, particularly their dominance on indigenous issues and their exploitation of indigenous peoples, has led, and also after liberation theology went belly up, which which people have somehow missed happened, but it did. That there's been a lot of conversion to often you're right, quite conservative, quite America-based evangelical movements in South and Central America. And like I said, it's also funny because, like, the opposite trend is happening in the U.S., where the evangelicals are probably the funny thing about evangelical Christianity is that until I was 20 years old, it was one of the fastest growing religious movements in the United States ever. And all the mainline the old Protestant groups, like, the boring Presbyterians and the Episcopals and all that, they were all dying, right? But then in 20 years since 9/11, that's reversed. Like, they're dying super fast. It's actually led to them becoming more and more and more conservative, because there's less of a spectrum of opinion in the evangelical group, because everybody else has just left. They've gone back to, men like, they just don't go to church, frankly. Like, no one cares about church. We're becoming a lot more like Europe in our secularization, right? And conversely, because of immigration from Latin America and because of diaspora tensions, I think, the Catholic Church is actually growing in its outreach here, even though it's also hemorrhaging members like crazy. It's just, so many people are moving up from Latin America, and a lot of them are Catholic. But there is this whole, like, Latino evangelical thing, even in the States, that played some role, for example, in the mild increase of the Republican GOP base coming from Latino areas, that, like, no one has noticed. And it's a much bigger deal, actually, in South America, as you've been pointing out. it's really changing the political landscape, which is why I think, like, particularly in poorer countries where things are less developed, I do think that you're going to have to really look at religious stuff to understand what's going on in Latin America until things get more stable, I guess. I think that's like, kind of like an elephant in the room for a lot of the reasons, like, traditional right parties and, and all that are kind of floundering right now. Let's talk about one last thing, and then I need to let you go. Although, Camilo, you're always welcome, and I'm going to also have you plug your own stuff at the end here. I'm going to try to, not just you, I'm going to try to get different specialists on, and people from the regions of the world, so the U.S. left isn't so dumb about foreign politics. You heard me. I called you dumb. And so I think that's going to be pretty important for people to understand. But I want to talk about this. What's going on in Colombia?
Well, of Colombia, I know fairly less,
Okay.
but I have, what has been on the news is kind of the killings of indigenous and Afro-Colombian activists. The issue is that it is curious because I see a lot of people praising the stance of Colombia on Venezuelan immigration. It's true that that it's important to receive the refugees, but the issue is that the government is kind of using that for not trying to come to excuses to not defend indigenous leaders who are basically and Afro-Colombian leaders who are basically being killed by the paramilitary. So the government in Colombia is fairly right wing, even if because of obviously being anti-Venezuela is receiving is kind of accepting of Venezuelan refugees. It's interesting to question what is going to be the role of Venezuelan immigrants that are going to play in the politics in Latin America. Are they going to go to the right always?
They go to the right in the United States. So
that's true. At the same time, like there have been a lot of Cuban exiles, which haven't been that much political, to be honest.
So they haven't been. So they don't have the same character as the about Florida, right? Where like we have super conservative Cuban exiles who were like. Who basically work with a bunch of rednecks in the north to keep Florida a Republican state.
Yeah, basically, I do think Colombia is much more complicated because it has a much more mixed identity. So unlike Andean countries like Ecuador or Peru or Bolivia, the indigenous movements, while they are important, they don't reach the majority of the population. So
there's not as much indigenous versus Criollo as much as there's just a kind of like mestizo big identity, right? Is that the difference, or
much bigger in Colombia?
Okay.
And one of the things that I think it is worth rescuing of Colombia is the issue that the indigenous and Afro-Colombians kind of seem working much more together than in other parts of the region where there is basically no mention. Sadly, there are not many visible representatives of the Afro-Latino communities in many countries.
Yeah, I was going to say
part of the population.
Well, I mean, I told you about my friend who to me, when I would see her, she looks Latina, but she told me that in the Peruvian context, she was Afro-Peruvian, and they have almost no political representation. And I couldn't tell. So, again, I think I have, I have a fairly adroit understanding of Latin politics for a gringo, but I am still a gringo. So it's something that I think the Afro-Latino I think it's interesting that it hasn't developed as much in some of the more leftist or more traditionally considered leftist areas like Peru and Bolivia, etc., where it seems to be such a big deal in Colombia.
Yeah, I do think it is. Now that you mention, it is worth noting that in Bolivia there is actually tensions between the indigenous group because, like, since the Aymara are very centered, like the Aymara particularly live in the more Andean parts of the region, but there are other indigenous people like the Quechua. It seems that they are kind of sharing a space of power in some way. But it seems that like the Tupi Guarani who live in the rural parts of Santa Cruz are kind of complaining that basically the government of Evo Morales allow like kind of massive like the Paraguayan model in some ways. So the deforestation, in order to have more cows and developing a meat industry in some ways.
So in Bolivia, there's clearly inter-indigenous tensions that
Yeah, I will say so. Even within the Aymara, I think there is much more diversity, even in the left wing Aymara. Not all the left wing Aymaras support the mass per se, but I do think it is the some analysts argue that the mass is the only national party, like the only party that has presence everywhere. Even in Santa Cruz, they have presence. So we're noting also that while it's true that the natural place of the more common place where the Aymaras are found, it is in the highlands, so in La Paz, El Alto. There are a lot of people from there that have moved to Santa Cruz. So and many of them are quite sympathetic to the mass. So they have a base of support there also. In that sense, they have considered it kind of an hegemony. It is difficult to say in which way you have been mentioned evangelicals. Also, the a lot of the indigenous people that support the mass are evangelicals. The mass it is not anti-woke in this common sense, but it's not that socially progressive as some people would like. And there are elements in the mass that are much more socially progressive, but as their official positions are quite moderate. So there is that kind of development.
Is abortion legal in Bolivia? I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, that's what I think. Most of Latin America, it's illegal. So that's usually like a test on how strong your progressive social your progressive social issue movement is. So yeah, it's interesting to me that just the U.S. left just doesn't deal with that in other countries, even though like in the United States that seems to be the primary issue that anyone cares about. So it's interesting. I think this factoid's interesting here. I did not know this. I thought the U.S. was higher on this. I knew Brazil was first. That the highest percentage of African descended peoples are in Brazil, Cuba, the United States, and apparently Colombia. So I did not know that. I thought that's an interesting fact. That may explain the difference in visibility.
Something I could add, but at the same time, I would say, for example, in Bolivia, the Afro-Bolivian population is very small. But for example, Los Jarcas, who is a folkloric band from there, that is probably the most known Bolivian folkloric band and one of the most known Andean folkloric bands in the world. They actually toured Japan even in the 80s. So they're like, people joke about big in Japan. They are big in Japan. Like, even to this day. One of his members actually is Japanese. But the funny thing is that they promoted themselves as Afro-Bolivian music, because a lot of the theories of the morenada, like the dances that are popular in the Aymara speaking parts of Peru and Bolivia, that its origin was the slave dances in Potosí. So I think that is kind of the explanation why it seems the Afro identity lives on even within a different identity.
Yeah, I can only imagine how difficult it is. This is another. I can only imagine how difficult it is for Afro-Mexican or Afro-Peruvian. I can't speak to Afro-Peruvian except for my friend, but Afro-Mexican is an interesting concept because there's probably a lot more people of African descent in Mexico than acknowledge any explicit Afro-Mexicano identity, which is fascinating because if you're like in Puebla, there's all kinds of African influences there, and there are lots of very dark people, but nobody will claim to be Afro-Mexicano. They all are just dark Mexicanos. And that, so I couldn't, I would say that the way that it's handled in Mexico seems to be assimilation. Also, Mexico has that whole cosmic La Raza idea that like everybody comes in. You could be Irish, you could be Nawa, you can be whatever, and we'll make you Mexican. Um, you know, uh, so there's that. But I will say my experience of racial tensions in Mexico was fascinating because the only time there was all kinds of implicit colorism and weird anti-indigenous sentiment. I'm not portraying Mexico as like some kind of woke paradise because it is not. But the only explicit racism that I saw was either towards Jews or even more commonly towards Chinese. Like there was a lot of anti-Chinese racial sentiment that has gone back for like a century there. Apparently, for example, Pablo Villa, like, in addition to giving gringos and Texas a hard time, he would just randomly massacre Chinese workers as part of his revolutionary agenda. All right, one last question, and then we're gonna have to sign off because I have another stream in 20 minutes, and I gotta use the bathroom. All right. How does the Japanese Peruvian family come to political prominence, like the Fujimoras? And that's always confused me too. What is Peru? There does seem to be a specific Peru Japan connection that I don't understand. So
Yeah, I do think basically he was run as an outsider, and the left was fractured, so he passed to the second round, and he did a clever campaign, and like won over Vargas Llosa, but like it seems he was trying his luck, and he had yeah, and it worked. So Japanese Peruvians are a smaller community compared to Chinese Peruvians, but they are quite prosperous.
are they richer? Because generally, in most of the diasporas I've seen, the Japanese tend to be not in America. Actually, America's different in this regard, but that the Japanese diaspora tended to be better off than the Chinese diaspora.
Yeah, they in general tended to be better off. Like he was an engineer, like Alberto Fujimori. A lot of Japanese people of the Japanese descent community study like hard science, engineering, and like work on STEM fields, which it doesn't pay as well as in other places, but it still pays way better than most jobs in Peru, which has a very informal economy. So 70% of the economy is informal. So even being a mathematics professor, maybe not the most fancy paycheck there out there, but still is, which was what Alberto Fujimori was. He was a he studied engineering, and he studied math and physics, and he was teaching math and physics at the National University, Agrarian University of La Molina.
Yeah, I a wake up call for me when I lived in Mexico was and also I encountered this in Egypt. The number of engineers I knew with crappy jobs. They were just happy to have any job, but they had a BA in engineering, and they were like the janitor at an international school, which paid better than they could make as an engineer. Like that blew my mind. that was a very big wake up call for relative poverty rates around the world. So Camilo, I keep on adding an L to your name and trying to like overpronounce it when I'm actually your name is pronounced like it's spelled in English. So where can they find your work? You do a podcast that's mostly in English, actually, I think, but or a mixture of English and Spanish.
I had a project to do it bilingual, but like basically in Peru they don't sell equipment for podcasts, so it was like a lot of people I tried to contact and didn't work the audio well. So like in Peru is very difficult even to buy a microphone because it's not common for people to have podcasts like in other parts. Like so, maybe I gonna do another in Spanish, but yeah. So my podcast is History and Politics. And I talk with different guests about different things. So my last interview was with Mutualate. I guess like he has interviewed you, and I also hope to cover Latin America more. I have covered it in the past. I have talked about the Bolivian process more generally with a historian there. And I have talked about different issues. Probably I'm gonna have I guess talking about intersection of economics and anthropology, which I think it's going to be interesting in the future. And yeah, I think it is kind of a very divergent. So about what I'm going to write next, probably is going to be a book review, and it's going to I'm gonna like in my Twitter, so it's Camilo, which is CAMELONGN in Twitter. So at that twitter.com/CamiloMGN, and then there I will put the link when it's published. So there's that.
Okay, that's awesome, and I'll probably have you back in a couple months, maybe once we have the actual results from some of these elections, and we'll try to talk about what it's going to mean for. I have one weirdo question that I will field before we go, but what it's going to mean for general Latin American politics, towards the middle, the end of the year, and we'll definitely be in touch. I do think, for example, understanding Latin American politics beyond Venezuela and Bolivia is super important, and not common. All right. Why does Chile have so many Coroboros, and are they the next revolutionary subject?
Well, I mean, it is curious because Chile had a very kind of weird culture. So emos were big. Like there was Pokemons who were basically people that listen reggaeton but still like dress as emos. But somehow they become kind of left wing with time, even if kind of emos were kind of apolitical. Yeah, I mean, K-pop is huge in Chile. The explanation why I guess in general Asian culture has become kind of very popular in Latin America. It is complex. In general, it's because in the 90s, like a lot of Latin Americans were kind of in a bad place, so they can't produce content, so they just fill it up with anime. and anime was kind of and J-pop was kind of the entryway to K-pop, and that's more or less how it worked more in much of the region.
Okay. Yeah, Mio, maybe I'll have you come back and we'll just talk cultural stuff, particularly like given your shirt. Asian pop culture and its influence in Latin America. I will say on that note, there are way more anime cafes and even semi-rural in Mexico than I ever thought I'd see. Like it was just weird.
I mean, in Peru, in Lima, there is a place that it has been called the Latin American Akihabara, the Centro Comercial de Arenales, the Arenales Shopping Center. It is curious.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, basically they just sell like stuff related to anime to keep up on American pop culture and nothing else.
Yeah, it was just weird because it was like it was anime from Japan, uh, telenovelas, and then K dramas were beginning to become popular in Mexico, and I was there, and I was like, I just saw these things. I lived in Korea prior. So yeah, that's gonna be. I think that's interesting because I think it says something about global trade, and I'm also interested if that's gonna stop. Now a lot of these things are. I don't know. I mean, with COVID changing a lot of the political dynamics around the world, it's going to be interesting to see what goes. But so just so my viewers know, one Camilo is going to Camilo. God damn it! I've known you for like 2 years. Camilo will be back on to talk probably about the results of the elections, and we might just have another one of these episodes just to talk about Latin American versions of weeb culture,
Yeah,
because why not?
yeah,
And because that sounds fun and it's a nice change of politics. But I do think you guys should listen to his podcast. It's in English. You don't even have to deal with Spanish. Although, guys, Spanish isn't that hard to learn. Just saying, it's not like we're asking you to learn Russian or Chinese or something. Like Spanish isn't hard. So although I say that as a person who will butcher anything I pronounce in any language other than English, probably even English. So you'll be back, Camilo. Check out History and Politics, particularly if you want to understand Latin America. It's nice and in English for you. And I will be doing more. I am trying to get more specialists from different parts of the world to come on and talk to you guys about left politics and politics in general and other places on the globe. And so that you can be more informed and not just listen to weird gringo white guys tell you what to believe. All right. Take care.
right.